What's up, 7th grade and everyone else out there watching? Tonight we're talking about a little bit of the military strategy the United States used in winning World War II, which is going to be the conclusion. I'm not spoiling anything for anybody here with that giveaway. But what we have to realize is that the United States fought the war in three main areas: North Africa, Europe, and Asia. The United States first fought the Germans in North Africa. And then eventually the war would shift into Europe, where the United States teamed up with the Soviet Union and the British to fight the Germans. What's really important to realize is that everything was going on simultaneously. The United States was fighting the war on multiple fronts, and each layer of the war represented a different goal, meaning the United States first had to win in North Africa before it could then invade Europe. And then after invading Europe, it was all about trying to get to Germany. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the United States fought a completely different war. The war was fought primarily with the advent of aircraft carriers, and I'll be getting into that more on the back end. But perhaps the turning point moment in Europe came when the United States, after having successfully defeated the Germans in North Africa, the United States eventually, with the British, devised the plan to invade France. France was the target to launch the entire invasion of Europe. From France, the United States could stage the invasion of Europe and eventually work its way to Berlin, the capital of Germany. But opening up France was the key. And the plan was set for the summer of 1944, and the date of the invasion of France will go down in world history as one of the most important dates, June 6, 1944. That was the date that's now referred to as D-Day, D-Day, June 6, 1944. A mass coalition force of American and British and Canadian soldiers stormed the beaches of a region in France called Normandy. And from Normandy, they fought their way onto the beachheads of France and broke through German defenses. And ultimately, this was all the progression of the United States and its allies to go from France to eventually Belgium and to eventually Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, who were our allies in the East, the Soviet Union were pushing on the Germans from the East, and the plan was to eventually meet in the middle in Berlin. That was the entire goal of the European strategy. And the Americans, of course, took the lead in this matter. Now, again, I'm not going to go too off the deep end too much here, but D-Day was the pivotal turning point in Europe because it set up the entire invasion of Europe. And leading the planning of D-Day is a future American president, Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower will become a president in the 1950s in the United States, continuing that theme of Americans electing war heroes. But Eisenhower's planning came at heavy cost. The Americans and our allies lost many soldiers fighting in the war for France, but France would be liberated, and eventually the United States and the Soviet Union would take Berlin. And the Germans would surrender in May of 1945. So a war that started in September of 1939 eventually ended in May of 1945. Hitler, by the way, did not surrender. He committed suicide before the Soviet Union armies advanced and took the city of Berlin. So together, it was a joint effort between Americans and our allies, the British and the Soviet Union. And what we're going to be focusing on later in the week is the sort of effects, because Europe is going to become eventually the target of the Cold War. And that's going to be what's going to happen after the World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union are interestingly going to become enemies. And their two systems of government are going to become very ideologically opposed to one another. And as a result, the United States and the Soviet Union are going to wage war ideologically, not actually physically, but they're going to wage war against one another, and they're going to eventually try to take control of parts of Europe. So it's a really interesting dynamic because you go from being allies, trying to win the war together, to eventually becoming enemies after the war, and that's going to be just a dynamic that the United States and Soviet Union are going to have to sort out, and we're going to deal with that after the war is over. Meanwhile, in Asia, the United States had turned to a strategy against the Japanese that relied on aircraft carriers and the Navy, but also ground troops to invade strategic islands. And this strategy that the United States used in Asia was known as island hopping. The United States moved from island to island throughout the Pacific, and sometimes fighting for tiny pieces of rock on which the Japanese had built airstrips, landing strips for planes. And the Americans wanted to take these islands because then the United States could launch planes to go bomb some parts of Japan. The fighting in both Europe and Japan, the Asian theater of war, was brutally hellish. People were dying in record numbers in world history during World War II, especially in Germany and the Soviet Union's case. But in the Pacific, the Japanese were just being annihilated. But slowly, it took a lot of American lives for the United States to eventually gain some ground in the Pacific. And basically, the Americans' intentions were to go from island to island to island before they eventually got to Japan. And getting to Japan was the key for the United States. But I'm actually going to now turn things over. His long-awaited return, our APUSH legend Christian Lee is back. He had some personal issues, and he's been dealing with graduating and working. So Christian is back. He's in good health, and he's ready to tell you about how the war in Asia particularly came to an end for the United States. So Christian, take it away.
What's going on, 7th graders? I know it's been quite a while since you guys have seen me, and been a little busy, but I'm glad to be back and helping out Mr. Smith here, especially with the topic that I am very passionate about, which is World War II. But today, specifically regarding World War II, we'll be talking about the war's end and the Manhattan Project, specifically referring to the war's end. And so let's dive in, okay? So the Manhattan Project, basically what it was the project to develop a weapon of mass destruction, which we would later known as the atomic bomb, or back then it was called the A-bomb. Now, the Manhattan Project was led by a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer. Okay, he was the lead scientist in this, I guess, top secret government project, and it was led at a facility in Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico, which my dad actually worked at for a little bit. And so it started there in 1942 after FDR received a letter from Albert Einstein, which it wasn't actually Albert Einstein, it was some of other German scientists that sent it to him saying that, Germany was getting close to realizing the full potential of uranium, which he was talking about building a weapon of mass destruction. And so that got FDR to kind of speed things up with America's own investigation and science in the science behind uranium and what they could possibly do with it. And so let's fast forward now to the end of the war, 1945. Okay, so the project is, nearing its end now, and the scientists have finally developed the bomb. Okay, so the bomb is tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which is where some of my family lives now, and so it was an underground testing, and they wanted to see, if it would work and what the potential effects of it were. And so what they realized is that they just created a weapon of mass destruction. And J. Robert Oppenheimer has a very famous quote. Maybe some of you guys have heard it, but once he realized what the bomb would do, he had this quote, and it was, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," because he just flat out realized that the science project that he'd been working on for the past 3 years was literally could be the end of the world, and because of how powerful it was. So by this point in the war, America had just finished up the Battle of Okinawa and won. And so now it was left to defeating the Japanese once and for all. The war in Europe was already over at this point. And so now America could focus all of its attention on defeating the Japanese. So like I said, by the time Okinawa was over, there was a huge, huge invasion force that was ready on standby, awaiting basically Truman's order to invade mainland Japan. But people knew that would come at a heavy cost. And so the estimated amount of American casualties and lives that people kind of think would have been lost had we invaded Japan by land would have been around 1 million troops, which would have been extremely costly. And so that's what it came down to. And a lot of people could arguably say that Truman had one of the hardest decisions in history. And that was, A, use this horrible, horrible weapon against the Japanese, or B, risk around 1 million American lives. You know, and so what he ended up doing was telling the Japanese, hey, I got a weapon and it will completely destroy you guys if you guys don't surrender. I'm giving you one chance. And the Japanese, due to their honor code, said no, they won't, because of I think it's called the Bushido or whatever it was that they were still practicing at this time. And so Truman's like, all right, you know, fine, you know, have it your way. And so then he gave the order, and on August 2nd, 1945, the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first nuclear weapon to ever be used against someone or other humans in history. And so, you know, it was devastating. And the Japanese still would not surrender, even after saying that Truman wasn't bluffing about the United States having a secret weapon of mass destruction. And so several days later, Japanese still didn't want to do anything. We bombed them again with a second one this time. And so the Japanese finally said, you know what, okay, we can't afford to be hit like this again. And so they eventually surrendered because they didn't have anything that could even come close to competing with the United States on that level. And so, fun fact, my grandma was actually living in Japan, despite I am Korean and she's Korean, but she was living in Japan and she actually saw the Nagasaki bomb with her own eyes. And she tells me stories about it, seeing it as a little girl. And so the Nagasaki target was actually not the original target for the second bomb. It was actually on its way to, I think, Yokohama, which is where my grandma was living. So I could not be here today as a possibility had that bomb actually made its destination. But the bomb was so heavy and the plane was burning fuel like crazy. So the secondary target was Nagasaki, which was a large military target. And so they dropped that bomb and the war was over. The Japanese finally formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, which would be known as VJ Day. And so, or Victory in Japan. So the Japanese surrendered basically almost unconditionally, with the exception that Emperor Hirohito remained as a figurehead of state for Japan after the war's end. But he would not have any power. And so that's kind of the wrap of the Manhattan Project. And so I hope that was helpful, and I wish you guys the best of luck on your upcoming comprehensive exams. All right? Talk to you guys later.
All right. Well, thanks, Cristiano. I really appreciate you being back. We're glad to see you on the Fireside Chats again. So just as a reminder, all this is fair game for tomorrow's team trivia event. So everyone should grab a whiteboard when they come in. We're going to start, and we're going to go over things tomorrow. We're going to pick some questions out of all this and test your knowledge on both the European and Asian theater of war and how those ended. So I'll leave you with that. As always, the past shapes the future. Everybody, take care and have a great evening.